Hi, today we're going to be discussing combating transphobia in policy, discussing the new wave of attacks coming from state, local, and federal government levels against trans people. This is essentially state-sanctioned violence against trans people, and we as LGBTQ people in general and trans people specifically need to be prepared to combat these attacks and to fight for our rights. Today, I'm going to be joined on this panel by Ivy Sticklow, the Hotline Program Coordinator and for Trans Lifeline and a trans activist. We're going to be joined by Representative Raven Mathern, who is a member of the Stamford Board of Representatives. And I'm going to be joined by Jerry Marie Leisgang, who is a longtime trans and health equity activist. Hello, everyone.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Hi, nice to see you all again.
Hello.
So we'll get right into the meat of things. What are the biggest issues affecting trans people locally and nationally that progress can be made on for a progressive cause, in your estimation?
I guess I'll jump in on this. I think one of the biggest things right now we're facing is just access to competent healthcare. Too often we think of it from the perspective of, there's a doctor that is adamantly against trans rights or something, and that we need to find a way to negotiate with this person to force them to give us medical access. But the reality is most doctors simply just aren't up to speed or aren't educated on what trans people are and what stuff that they're going through. So trying to get our medical resources up to speed and competent in LGBTQ matters is of the utmost importance, in my opinion. We have too many doctors that are well-meaning but are ill-informed, and that is just, in my book, that's just as bad as trying to intentionally do something bad. You end up with the same results. So.
I'd agree with that. Most importantly, it's been a long-term issue too, because I know way back when we were doing a lot of education. We still do. A lot of people still a lot of education with doxing things, but it's a never-ending story, like Representative Raven brought up. But I'd also say, I'd like to add into that, not just the healthcare aspect, but as part of healthcare, is homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters, sexual assault crisis centers, that they also need to be very open and access to the trans community. And something we know that is a big challenge, and we lack a lot of policies in those areas too, to help govern how they behave. We can do training, but the trouble is once the staff turns over, all the training is not. And we do need, like New York City has, like Boston has, we do need to have homeless shelter policies here in Connecticut that, and as well as domestic violence, that directly cover trans folks very clearly in the way the trans community wants to be covered.
Yeah, I definitely want to agree with what everybody said. Connecticut is a state where, for homeless youth in particular, there's a very disproportionate amount of LGBTQ homeless youth compared to other states. So it's definitely something that impacts trans people of all ages. And as we know, trans people are at an even higher risk of experiencing homelessness, particularly trans people of color. And adherent to that, right, we also have all the other violence that is enacted upon us by the state once we are experiencing poverty or experiencing homelessness or any other type of lack of access to resources. So we'll experience police violence, we'll experience workplace discrimination, hiring discrimination, even though, Connecticut supposedly had non-discrimination laws in place before it came down on a national level. Still, de facto, we were experiencing all of these things across the state. And I'm one of the people that's experienced workplace discrimination in this state. So these things are all very much connected. And I definitely want to second what Raven said. I would even say that a lot of the time when we're dealing with resources that purport themselves to be trans competent, or that are advertised as trans competent, or for example, in mental health, which is where I work, if you go on Psychology Today, you'll see a ton of different practitioners and providers who say that they work with trans people, but the reality is they have no idea how to work with trans people, and they're just saying that because they want to say that they're not discriminating against trans people, even though they have no experience actually supporting us. A lot of the time, that can be even more harmful than seeing somebody who says that they, like, seeing somebody's name who, and it says that they don't work with trans people, right? Because then I just know, versus showing up somewhere expecting trans competency and then being gaslit about it and being told, no, this is a trans competent practice. So I think we need to be very, very open about our criticisms and our demands of what providers are doing, what state agencies are doing, and how people are interacting with us, particularly with our youth, and how early, how quickly, and how really fundamentally our youth are being affirmed in their authenticity. Because the earlier we have access to that respect, and the earlier we have access to resources that affirm us, the better our quality of life, the better our mental health, and the better our physical health.
Yeah, and we've seen attacks from different government people on like a gender-affirming care for trans youth. Like Idaho, I believe it was, that criminalized doctors for gender-affirming puberty blockers and hormone therapy. Like, what? It seems like there's almost a national tide of like backlash against just any kind of affirmation for trans people of all ages. And like, what are the most powerful tools that we have as activists and organizers for fighting this wave?
I mean, I think the important, vital part of it is your voice. Like, if you have the ability to speak up and be heard, we come to a point where there is a responsibility to do so. Not everybody in our community has the ability to be able to speak up and be heard. Not everybody has the ability to do so from a safe place. It's very difficult to both fight for your life and call out and say, hey, I need a life jacket. It's a bit of catch-22 in my opinion. Beyond that, like in terms of what speaking out looks like, there are a plethora of different ways. There are, in my experience, there are a number of elected officials that are just not up to speed, but that mean well, in that when shown the situation in a light that they have not previously experienced it, are more than willing to act on it. I refuse to believe that humanity is evil. I refuse to believe that like every single person I go to is going to be against me because I'm trans. I think most people are trying to do the right thing and have been raised in a society that has led them down a route that doesn't like actually arrive at a positive conclusion when it comes to how they treat and handle trans people. Like, I always loop back to the scenario. I didn't learn about trans people myself until like I encountered it as a sex trope. And like, I was going with gender dysphoria my whole life. My exposure to it, like in society, was that. If I had to come through it that way, I can't imagine how members of the regular public get exposed to what a trans person is and then wrap their mind around that and then try to make that work with what it is that we try to show them trans people actually are. So again, it boils down, in my opinion, to if you are in a position to be a public voice, to do so, to try and put as many examples forward in the public narrative of what a trans person actually is, so that you can't water us down with what you want us to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, when we talk about organizing work, when we talk about mobilizing people, right? Because let's not get this twisted, right? Let's not get this wrong. Why is there a backlash? There isn't a backlash because suddenly some, you know, benevolent politicians decided to hand us our rights, even though there are people out there who do want to do the right thing. The reason why we were able to win the victories that we won is because thousands and thousands of people over the years mobilized in the streets and really lit a fire under people and really said, we're not backing down. We're not ceasing our organizing. We're not ceasing this mobilization that we're doing everywhere across the country until we get our basic human rights, until we are recognized for who we are, until we have access to economic rights, to social rights, to all different forms of legal affirmation of who we are, right? And these movements are still happening. And all of these movements that are happening right now, right? We're seeing people, again, thousands and thousands of people rising up against the scourge of police terror in this country, right? This is an issue that directly affects trans people, like I said earlier. When people rise up to say, cancel the rents, when people rise up to say, end homelessness, when people rise up to say, you know, stand up for immigrant rights, all of these issues are issues that affect trans people in a dire way. Racism affects trans racialized people in a dire way. Immigrant issues like immigrant discrimination, deportation, detention affects trans immigrants in a dire way, more so than cis people. So when we look at people's movements, when we look at giant mobilizations across the country, it is crucial that we add the additional necessary lens to all of those movements of how much this is of value to trans people and how we can make these movements powerful for trans people, empowering of trans people, and resulting in things that allow trans people to live dignified, respected lives. This is all, again, part of one thing, it's part of one system. We can build this to be a broader movement as long as we keep talking about trans rights in the context of all the movements that are happening.
And just to add on to that, I agree with you 100%, because the one thing I learned in my life is that coalition building is critical. That you can look around a bunch of room with a lot of people and say, help me with my problems, but everybody in that room has issues. They're all dealing with different issues, and we need to work as one. The gay and lesbian community perverted this civil rights movement for queer people by being so single issue focused with marriage, with other things like that. And we need to break away from this whole single issue view. We need to realize things are multi-issue. They're not single issue. And how do we connect the dots? How do we work the dots? And as Ivy stated, with immigration, within a lot of other, within police brutality, there's a lot, a common thread is trans folks being oppressed by that. And, as Raven said, our voices, we're not all empowered to have our voices. But if we can, that's very powerful, to be out and to be visible. It's hard to be out, especially as trans person. It's extremely hard to be out. You take a lot of oppression, you risk a lot in your life. You risk your family, you risk your jobs, if you're fortunate to have one. You risk your health care. But no matter what, it's still, we need to be visible, because that's what helps change people. You see that in any movement, what happens is people will say, well, I thought all trans people were like that. But then I had a friend or I had a child who said they're trans. And we heard a lot with legislators saying that. A lot of legislators moved because all of a sudden family members came out. And all of a sudden their tone was totally different. And so visibility to me is very, very important, but it's a double-edged sword for our community.
Yeah, I would actually, just jumping on that, I would agree. I think this visibility is most definitely a double-edged sword, and no matter what we do, one edge is going to be leveled at us. I think we should be doing everything that we can to make sure that we're getting what we can from the other side as well. I've always said, like, with the federal administration's attacks on trans rights, it has been a bit of a mixed blessing in a sense, because I used to talk to people about trans stuff and just couldn't get traction. It was a issue that didn't affect people, so they didn't have the attention span for it. But when it comes out of the president's mouth, no matter what they're saying about it, it brings it to the forefront. So it's been churned up. I think we have a unique opportunity to utilize the energies that have been leveled against us in a way to bring attention and light to the fact that trans people are suffering and are fighting. Like, I always sort of use my own life a little bit as an example here, but before I came out of the closet, I was a professional martial artist. I had a life and a career, and I came out of the closet and immediately lost my career. That door closed to me. I was incredibly lucky to be able to run for office and be able to do that successfully, but that's not a normal trans story. That's not the normal trans narrative. I laugh and giggle. I came out of the closet and then got to lead a parade. People don't usually get that experience. You come out of the closet and you lose everything. It's like having a safety net ripped out from underneath you. And that's something that the trans community mutually shares, and it affects us all differently to different degrees, but we also have to fight it. We also have to figure out ways to help support that safety net for others when we're in a position to do so.
So that is a good segue to my next question. So there are there are ways economic rights are trans rights, and like issues of police brutality disproportionately affect trans people, for example. And one area where those intersect is in criminalization of the underground economy, which disproportionately hurts like trans women of color. And like, is what can we do to like protect like economic, like to build opportunities and protect the civil rights of people who might be engaged in the underground economy as trans people?
So I mean, this will start getting into a whole deep thing with me, but it depends on what we're calling the underground economy. In my opinion, whenever we come up against stuff like that, we see in action the limitations of government. Government exists, or I should say life exists beyond government. Like we all came to be long before government came to be. You can make as much stuff as you want illegal, but there's without a way to actually affect change in a positive manner, it doesn't do you any good. And in fact, it drives certain groups underground. So again, this leaves a little bit of space for what we're considering the underground economy, which is anything and everything, in my opinion. But I'd be curious to see what other panel listeners would have to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something similar to Raven, right? But we can look at it from a few different lenses, right? On one hand, how are trans people disproportionately affected, particularly trans women? A lot of people are forced into being in the underground economy because of lack of access to employment or social safety nets elsewhere, right? A lot of other people are profiled. For example, like a lot of trans women of color are profiled as sex workers without being sex workers. So there's two different angles there, right? There's for people who are engaged in underground economies, either because they want to be or because that's their only option. There's criminalization, there's police harassment, there's police violence, there's sexual police violence in particular against sex workers. So there's a lot of answers that are floated around that, around decriminalization or legalization of sex work. From another angle, ending the war on drugs, which is another very common area of underground economy work that trans people engage in, is selling drugs. A lot of us have had to do it. There's a lot of different angles that we can approach this from. And then on the other side is also for trans folks who are not in underground economies, but are assumed to be due to discrimination, due to profiling. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. And a lot of different people have different positions on this, but I think ultimately speaking, we need to end criminalization of trans people as a whole, whether that be through allowing for safer avenues of access to what's now considered underground economy work, or whether it be through just putting more restrictions on police and more civilian oversight over the police, or whether it be through giving people access to employment in other ways, and actually holding bosses accountable for when they discriminate against or abuse trans workers, which is something that happens all the time and there's no recourse. So strengthening our labor unions, strengthening our rights as workers, strengthening our rights as unemployed people. There's a lot of different angles that we can approach this from, and I think we need to approach it from all of those angles at once. And that's my opinion.
And I definitely agree with everything that's been said. And it brings up that there's really two views to look at it. There's social and economic injustices that's broad to many communities, of which the trans is one, which we need to work in coalition with and be out in the streets with and affect change with, policies with, be vocal with our legislators with, to do that. And then there's one related specifically, we can pull out and tweeze out, how do we help our own? In that case, like one thing, I did a call to action the last Transgender Day of Remembrance, because I've been doing the Transgender Day of Remembrance since it began. And every year we go and we remember the people, we read the names, we do the same thing. and everybody puts everything in a pile and comes back to it next year. What do? And the key thing is, what's the root, and we can do, we can have day remembrance and that of doomsday. Isn't going to stop the damn murders. What is the root cause? And the root cause is, we said, social and economic injustices. How do we change that? And the key thing is, everybody who comes to a DOR, what are you going to do during the year to help affect the trans community, help improve the lot of trans community? If you have an employer, can you get them employed? What can you do to help them move ahead? If they need, when I was running trans advocacy, we used to just donate money to people. We had people who couldn't afford where to live. I remember giving somebody paying a flight to get to California because they were being harassed by their pimp. They had, it was just not working for them here. And then their life, opportunities turn around their life. They may and they may not. But, what can we do as individuals? And there's a lot we can do. So, I look at it through two lenses.
Yeah, so kind of going off what Jerry Marie just said, where do we draw the line between things that require individual action and things that require collective action? And how do the two synergize and interact for fighting for trans rights?
My initial thought right off the bat is, what's the difference? Collective action starts with singular action. Like there needs to be a person willing to go a little bit further than the people before them did, and people get around behind that person, and you start a movement. There's nothing more powerful than the power of a single voice. It always boils down to that. Just about getting people out, getting people willing to take part, getting people willing to make sure they're heard and counted. One of my most eye-opening things was after I got a .gov email, was just how much our government is actually ruled by those .gov emails. Like, you'd be surprised what it does, what it is that actually makes a politician quiver or fear. And it's those emails, is when their constituents start writing back. If a trans person writes to their representative and says X, Y, and Z bad things happened to me, you may get a response, you may not. If a number of people do, it becomes more and more prevalent. So it really, I've said this before, and every time I've done something with New Haven Pride Center, call your representative. If you're available, if you're in a position where you can, even consider running for office. Being as loud and as visible and as prevalent as possible is by far the best way to affect change. There's no replacement for it.
No, and I'd agree with that. It's important. We don't hear, politicians don't hear a lot from the trans community, I'm convinced, because we struggle a lot with that. There's activists that do it, things like that, and we have lobby days to hear a bit, but it really moves legislators when they hear the voices of trans folk and talking to them and things. And I will say, federal level is like beating your head against the wall. Trying to go to lobbies days, and I've been to DC lobby days, and they're nice and everything like that. But I remember once a legislator said to me, "You're here looking for change in your state, but no state has any changes, has no gender identity or expression coverages. And so you're expecting us to make a change here at the federal level?" And it dawned on me. I said, I need to affect change at a local level. And that's what I went back and just focused on Connecticut. But we need, we need to think globally, but act locally. And so with what Raven says is, our legislators are there. They're highly accessible. They really are. And don't send an email, go see them, talk to them. Let them see a face and put your story behind the face. Because I tell you, I remember Representative Beth Bye. One thing that moved her an awful lot was she listened to 3 trans folk stories. And was common with all of them was suicide, attempted suicide. And that moved her to no end and moved her to being a strong advocate for trans folks. And, go figure. It's an opportune chance. It may work, it may not. But it has a lot of impact when said the right way and brought the right way. And also, we as a community need to help our community on how to talk to legislators. Because a lot of times we're going with a lot of anger. And that isn't going to go anywhere with a legislator. And so it's important to help say, they have to tell a story. We're not framing a story for them or anything like that. We're just saying, here's, when you talk to your legislators, what do you think are your most important points? Help them tweeze out the storyline before they get there.
Yeah, and I think that we also, in addition to what's already been said, there's also things that we can still do outside of interacting with elected officials and legislators. Even if you're being ignored with the emails that you send, or even if like a lot of people are being ignored with the emails that we send, or showing up to people's whatever office hours or moments where we can interact with the people. It's a lot harder to ignore when you have a large popular movement that is going to put out its own media, that's going to put out its own content, that's going to put out its own narrative and its own people's voices, no matter what anybody says. And right now we have something that's really powerful, which is the internet. We have a lot of different ways that we can be visible. And so even if individual interactions with a legislator or a politician or elected official are getting you nowhere, the more people you have behind you and the more of a genuine grassroots popular movement you have, the better you can build and the harder you become to ignore, even if you're beating your head against a wall on any particular level interacting with the people who are supposed to be listening to your voice.
So how do we build this grassroots popular movement? Is it through coalition work and just trying to, like Raven was talking about, raise our voices and say, like, you probably care about a trans person, and kind of make it known the hazards that trans people are up against?
Well, I'll talk a little bit to the history I had, because when I started advocacy in Connecticut, I remember we were asked to lead the Pride Parade, and I could only get one other trans person to be visible and out with me that day. We were highly closeted, highly invisible. We had the 20 Club, had the COS, et cetera, but there were more clubs and no activism. I remember I was in the 20 Club, and I remember saying, let's get politically active. And they said, oh, no, we can't do that. We'll lose our rights. And I said, what rights? We have no rights. But they were privileged. That's why they thought they had rights. But a lot of people don't have rights. And so for me, I couldn't get the trans community mobilized, because they were just too scared, and I understood why. It made a lot of sense. So I ended up doing coalition work with NOW, National Organization of Women in Connecticut, QUELF, Connecticut Women Educational Legal Fund, ACOU or CCOU then, and I worked with a lot of the directors of these agencies, and also was on their boards, because I said, I can't come to your table and tell you got to help me. I need to help you also. I need to understand what your needs are. I need to work with your needs. How do we help each other? If we're with the Hispanic Health Council, and that's a big mistake LMF made. LMF never went to anybody's table. They expected everybody to come to their table. And that was a big negative mistake. It's just a white, privilege-driven organization. And then it's had the audacity to fold, thinking, well, that was the last big issue we got in Connecticut, which is a bunch of bullshit. But I would just say coalition building, I think, is very important. And I also say, nothing more powerful than one person talking to another person. That's very empowering. And also being in the media. I remember way back in 2000, sometime around then, Hartford Courant did a page one article on me. And it empowered a lot of trans people, because there I was with a picture on page one, and people then said, wow, she's out. And I remember Tony Ferrello used to say a story that he remembers seeing me at Pride in New Haven. This was many years back. And he said, there's this crazy woman running back and forth filling balloons, extremely happy. And he said, if she can be happy, why can't I? And it really helped transform him, what he does. So I will say our individual actions help move people too.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been kind of talking about this whole time, right? There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's already enormous movements that are happening on the ground. I think our role as trans organizers and as trans community members is to plug into those movements, be a source of support in them, help develop trans and queer leadership in them, actually serve our people that are struggling the most. Actually provide opportunities for leadership from the people who are struggling the most, both within our trans community and outside our trans community. And I think what Jeremy is referring to as coalition building, right? That happens on a grassroots movement level as well, is when people are able to see the common roots of their issues, the systemic common roots of their individual special oppressions that they experience, and are able to work together, to march together, to organize together, to strike together, to shut things down together, you know, to demand change together. Whatever that looks like for you, there are people that would benefit from the same thing, even if they're not trans. So I think we need to be establishing trans leadership in those movements, and we need to be unapologetically saying that all of the movements that people are building, all of the coalition work that people are doing does include trans issues. It is trans issues and should include trans leadership.
Yeah, and continuing on that note, one thing I would say that I have been impressed by, though not surprised, is with this more recent reckoning of in our country of the Black Lives Matter movement. At all these protests, it fills me with joy to see a lot of queer involvement at these places as well, because that is the nature of coalition building. Find groups that are going through similar issues, that are going up against similar issues that your group is against the system. And there is quite a lot of common ground between the queer experience and the person of color experience in this country. We both are moving against issues that are inherent in the system against us. Our issues are not the same, but they are similar, and we are able to find a way to, again, make our group larger, make our group bigger, make our group louder, make our group that much harder to ignore. And especially when we look at the rate of issues that queer people encounter in minority spaces, reaching out into these groups is both immediately beneficial for queer people, as well as having a greater radiating benefit of all these movements having queer voices.
For sure. And, you know, it's obviously, it's not like it's two separate circles, right? It's more of a Venn diagram. When we look at shared lived experience, a lot of time people already discuss like queer issues and issues of racialized people, but there's that in-betweeny area too, which a lot of us belong to. And I think, yeah, we need to be cultivating leadership accordingly. And that's what we're seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement too. So much trans leadership, so much queer leadership, you know, by Black and brown, queer and trans people. And that's exactly what we need to be seeing.
Yeah. So what could a well-meaning cis ally do to plug in and advocate for trans rights? Just call elected officials, join movements, help build coalitions. Like what are some action items that people could take to like get involved and like get involved with something locally, like the Department of Education move against Connecticut's trans-inclusive high school sports policies and the lawsuit against the state? Like, what could people plug into that and provide support? Or yeah, what are ways that people can get active if they're not trans?
I would say the first thing they should do is get to know organizations that are in the area. Now, who you know, what are trans? Because they don't, they need to get educated on trans. They need to understand trans, etc. And really, what they should be doing is saying, "What can I do to help you? What do you need?" And that's what you should say of any oppressed community that you're not a part of. How can I help? What are the issues? Help educate me. What are my oppressions? Make sure they're dealing with their own transphobia, things like that. And so that's always the very first step. But I would say, and we have a lot of disparate organizations, but we have a lot of organizations that deal with trans in Connecticut. And so it's easy enough to find people, or if you know a trans person, ask a trans person, and work with other organizations rather than just working isolation as a trans cis person. But also, and then also, use their voices. I'll stop there.
So again, I say this all the time, and I'll say it again: call your elected officials. You'd be surprised that even when you're getting ignored, so to speak, you're going in a tally on that the secretary is keeping in terms of, well, we received X amount of calls about going against LGBTQ rights. And these do affect policy. You may not get that individual call back. You may not get Himes or whoever your reps or senators or anyone are. You may not get that personal conversation, but that little bit does count. It does go towards whether or not a politician is willing to take a stand. For example, if you've got a very conservative representative, calling them, tell them that you support queer rights is going to make them far less likely to show up to anything that's going to be taking down your rights. They're not going to want to show their face because they're afraid. They don't think they'll get your vote, but they are afraid they're going to flare up your base. So being heard by all parties that you care about queer things is of the utmost importance. In my opinion, it's where it starts to no longer be a partisan issue, unfortunately. Let me rephrase this. Unfortunately, queer rights have become very partisan in our political environment right now. Speaking up, depending on who is your representative, can have very different effects, either making some louder or some quieter. But no matter your affiliation, no matter your other beliefs, simply making that call and saying, hey, I live here and I care about queer people will tip the scale a little bit more in one direction or another. I can't tell you how many times a politician that would typically be in favor of something has simply chosen not to speak up as loudly or to not bring it up at all and let a counterpart bring it forward. Like, it's more nuanced than black and white, a politician's support for an issue. And the more times we show that it is not popular to tear down trans rights or queer rights, the less likely you're going to be to see politicians trying to make that their base. I always laugh. I think one of the best things that happened was when Danica Roem took the seat of the person that brought forward the bathroom bill. Like, that was a very strong statement on, if you run against trans people, you are putting yourself at risk. Another thing, and this is going to touch on a whole different topic, but something that always makes me smile is when Pride comes around and every company wants to put a rainbow flag on their stuff to sell things. I think the practice is abhorrent, but it does make me happy because we're recognizing that the queer dollar changes things. Like, these overarching principles feed and grow and start to make changes as they start to erode the things that tear apart queer society, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Oh God, you said so many things that make so much sense. I think something to keep in mind, right, is like a big argument that people make about deprioritizing trans rights. So like, even people that aren't necessarily openly, actively transphobic, they often make the argument of like, well, trans people are such a tiny fringe minority of the population. Like, why would we make all these big changes just to accommodate for people that like barely exist anyway? First off, that's not true. There's a lot of us and there's a lot more of us, and people are freaking out at how many more of us there are than they thought, which is cool. Like, yes, please, let's be more vocal if we can. But that also poses, right, a counter argument of, if there is a small group of people that is being discouraged from living and surviving, then the only way to make sure that our rights are stood up for is to make sure that we're not the only ones doing it. So absolutely, like, tell your cis friends that their voice is necessary, because a lot of the time people will not listen to trans people, but they will listen to cis people. Because that's just how systemic transphobia works. I think also, and I'm not really one to talk about stuff on an individual level. I'm definitely much more of a systems and movements person, but I do want to plug the real genuine power that every single person has about affecting change in how people view gender in your day-to-day lives, right? It's very easy to be like, oh yeah, I totally I stand up for trans rights, and I believe in standing up for bills that prohibit discrimination against trans people. But then you have family members throwing gender reveal parties and you're not saying anything about that, right? Like, practices like that inherently incorporate transphobia into society. They also incorporate discrimination against intersex people into society. There's a lot of things that are ingrained and normalized in our culture that people constantly replicate and constantly engage in, that are inherently transphobic systemically. And these are all things, like the gender reveal thing is just one example, right? But like lack, for example, of gender neutral bathroom access in your workplace or in your school or wherever. People saying like, I'm attracted to both men and women. Simple things like that, that people do not consider to be serious issues, are all part and parcel of the same systemic cis sexism and trans exclusionary culture. And a lot of the time where our brains go when we hear something like that is like, oh, why are you focusing on these minor things when there are trans people that are being literally attacked in the streets? It's like, no, this is all part of the same culture, right? When cis actors play trans characters of the wrong gender, when all these things happen culturally, I can keep spitting out these little things that people don't tend to think about as problems. These are very easy things for us to talk about in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces, with our friends. But a lot of the time people don't consider them serious enough things, but they all contribute to transphobic culture. And there are ways that we can dismantle that, at least on an individual basis, at least in the spaces that we exist in. And I strongly encourage people to look critically at what kind of culture you espouse in your workplace, in your school, in your home. What kind of language and practices are you allowing or encouraging? And how can that affect a trans person who's maybe in that same space who isn't out? Or who is out but just doesn't have the energy to say anything. And I think we can also affect change on the small scale in that way too.
One thing I would just want to add on to that, I agree with everything you've said, and I think we've mentioned a lot about the importance of a voice, is just when we're asking for trans people to advocate for themselves, we are asking a group that is already under a significant burden to basically unburden themselves to advocate for themselves. I always double back to it takes white voices to help to help people of color be liberated. It also takes cishet voices to help trans people's stories get heard. As a trans person, I'll listen to more trans people easily. That doesn't cross my mind as a thing, but it's difficult to get cishet people to think I need to reach out to a trans person to have that level of education.
Yeah, so what it feels like almost like we're playing catch up with things like HSS, Health and Human Services, reversing the equal access rule with Trump, or the Trump administration, changing healthcare, allowing religious exemptions for healthcare treatment. Like, what will it take to get us to a place where trans rights are secured and we're not like playing catch up every time there's a conservative administration that is enacting these policies?
We need widespread social acceptance of trans people. We need to see this issue evolve beyond being a partisan topic. It's one of my favorite things. The people I've been introduced to since I came out are the Republican trans women that I've met. In my opinion, those are heroes. I disagree with just about everything they believe with, except their gender identity. But I see how that is going to be a very, very necessary step towards seeing a future where trans people are accepted and it's not politicized. We're not having to fight for rights that are perceived as unique or different. Yeah, that would be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, and I'd add to that is, I think it's also the nature of movements and movement building and acceptance. Is because if you look back, civil rights movement, we're still struggling, we're still fighting in that area. We make some movement accomplishments that our communities have, but gay and lesbian community, we made some advances, but I still say you got marriage, but there's still unemployment discrimination throughout many states, and so it's a long-term process, and I think gender identity or expression goes to the core of many people's religious beliefs of man and woman and stuff like that. And so I think it's even more complicated than other things for people to really wrap their mind around and understand. I think the gender fluidity movement, things like that people have been doing. I think the language and the approach of the trans community over the years has really improved significantly. And I think that's helping change things. But you're always going to have 20% who are going to be against you. And you're going to have 20% who are going to be for you. And it's a 60% movable middle that you really want to work for. And really keep really work to get them to your side. And I'm not sure where I'm going now. I think I'm sort of rambling at this point. But I'll stop there.
I was laughing at this question because I always have the same answer. I think that, from my lived experience, like both being from not the US and having family who's lived in other countries, I think that the one thing that cements our rights is having a different economic system where like people don't benefit economically from our oppression. We can normalize ourselves and we can assimilate ourselves into an oppressive economic system all we like, but there's only so far that can go. And unfortunately, the way that patriarchy under capitalism works is it will consistently benefit off of the oppression of trans and queer people. So it's my belief that we need a different economic system where our rights are constitutionally enshrined, where they're not up for debate, where anybody who's elected to public office is beholden to upholding trans rights. And that's not something that is an option anymore. That's not something that people can have a different platform from anymore. Because we have that in other ways, right? In the current US Constitution, we have other things that are considered inalienable. Why not our rights? Why not our social rights? Why not our economic rights? We can absolutely have that system. And that's, for me, as a political organizer and as a trans person and as somebody who works in mental health and sees how much mental health is tied to people's material conditions, that's what I always go back to, is we need to change our material conditions and we need to change our basic constitutional rights. That's where I stand.
I would have to say I agree with you entirely. I think for me, it becomes a question of what changes first, though, the economic conditions or society's views of trans people. I don't think you can have one without first achieving the other. And I think that our biggest goal, our biggest hurdle is going to be to simply change the way the trans narrative is played out in American society right now. Once that happens, I think you'll have a much easier time trying to make further, more widespread progress, which would affect, just about any minority group I can bring my mind across right now. But the first steps there are going to be trying to find more common ground. As Jeremy said before, like there's a fight for the 60% and there's 20% we're just never going to get. I used to joke that when I got elected, it was the worst job ever because right off the bat, half the people liked me and half the people hated me. I was a little lucky because a little more than half liked me and that's how I got it. But that's, unfortunately, those precipices are kind of crossing those thresholds are what our society is built upon. I think in order for us to make any headway, we need to first make headway in the way society views things. It needs to be unpopular to attack queer people before it will be illegal to attack queer people. Otherwise, if you try to put that in place first, you're just going to see the other side of the country complain of the same issues and try to overthrow stuff, in my opinion.
So we have a question from the audience on Facebook asking, why aren't trans people represented more in the ongoing civil rights struggle in the United States? And I know that's been answered to some degree, but curious to hear what y'all have to say.
One thing I'll say, and I, I'm only speaking from my view, and my view is probably naive too, is we have to be very careful not to co-opt communities and not to co-opt causes. And I'll give you a good example, intersex. I remember way back, this is back in probably the 80s, and a lot of trans people were using intersex as a way to justify who they are and things like that. And there was a big backlash in the intersex community on trans folks and the co-op of trans folks of the intersex issues. And I remember working with bodies like ours. We did some demonstrations here in Connecticut in support against intersex surgeries, things like that. But we did it in coalition building with the Intersex Society of North America or with bodies like ours. And it made me very sensitive and very aware of it's very easy to co-opt or to alienate communities by starting to say, well, your issues are my issues. Now, we have common issues and things, but the civil rights movement's been around for a long time. And, and it's at least my view of the civil rights movement is what I'm looking at. And maybe you look at it different ways, but if you look at the Black civil rights movement, that's you want to be very careful not to sort of co-opt anything there. So I'll stop there. I don't know. Like I say, it may be a very naive view, and I apologize if it is.
So I would say, yeah, no, definitely. We would want to be trying to make sure we're not co-opting anything, but I think we find progress when we find common ground. And when we're looking at a large number of movements that are being held down by built-in systemic issues, it's hard not to see the common ground. We all know what it's like to struggle against a system that was designed in a way to hold us down, to hold us back. It does so in different ways, but we both can see it. We can all see it. I think finding that common ground, finding that common narrative is where you build coalition and where you make progress. I think you can overstep that by taking the lead in a place where you have no place to do so. For example, I have no place taking the lead or taking the mic from a Black voice. I don't. And when we're talking about Black liberation, that's not my place. Supportive, yes. Trying to learn as much as I can, yes. Trying to find common ground where we can work together to make even more progress, definitely. I think it's understanding your roles in different environments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading over the question. I think I can understand it a couple different ways, right? Like, you can understand it as like, why aren't trans people included in like civil rights movement like Black Lives Matter? And the fact is we are. So that's my answer to that. Like, there's a lot of Black trans voices that are in the leadership of these movements. So that's my answer to that. If I were to interpret the question differently in terms of why isn't there a broader nationwide trans rights movement that is more unified and that acts, in a broader way, similarly to Black Lives Matter? I don't have an answer for that, but I think that we are in a political, historical moment right now where we could absolutely build that. And there's a lot of people that are recognizing that they do have a place in the movement. They don't need to be a seasoned organizer. They don't need to be involved in anything previously. They can step into a movement. There will be a place for them. So I think right now we're at a really important historical moment where no matter who gets elected in November, we need to keep that movement building. We need to keep that movement swelling. And we need to build a nationwide trans rights movement with leadership from the most oppressed trans people. So if that's what the intention of the comment was, I absolutely agree that that's something that A, we should do, and B, right now we're in a strategic position to be able to build.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure how to interpret that question entirely either. But I like your interpretation, Ivy. So what are tangible goals for like the next 6 months for the trans struggle in the United States as we work to build coalitions and build a movement? Like, what should our policy goals be, or what should our goals be? What should our results that we're looking for be?
So I do think, in trying to wrap I know we're coming to a close on this. I think one of the things that is interesting for us here in Connecticut is there's been a nationwide dialogue about trans student athletes. And it's kind of been the Idaho approach, which has been very trans discriminatory versus what we've been able to do in Connecticut, where we allow trans athletes to participate and we don't subject them to ridiculous medical interventions and able to access these rights. Unfortunately, out in Idaho, it gets a ton of press coverage, and here in Connecticut, where things go well for trans people, it's just kind of like, oh, everything's fine. It gets swept under the rug. I think one thing that we have before us here, in my idea of trying to, whenever you have an energy or a light brought to something, to utilize it in a positive way, we have the opportunity to try and blow up the attention that trans athletes have in Connecticut and show how positive it is, show how they are able to compete, how we are able to preserve a fair playing field for all. Like in Connecticut, we have done what other states have not and created for trans athletes a little trans utopia of sorts. We should be showing this off to the rest of the country, saying, look, this works. It's not hypothetical. It's not crazy witchcraft. This is what works. We have the receipts. Unfortunately, Connecticut's been very quiet on this. It's actually one thing that I did in Stanford that I'm proud of. We passed a resolution, which has no legal weight in the sense it's not a law, but it is the city of Stanford urging the government of Connecticut to publicly support trans rights. Having people make that call and having a major elected official make public statements supporting trans people goes a very long way.
And I will say, it's my experiences over the years has been what you just said, Raven, is it's hard to get a momentum of voices or, talking about what we've accomplished in the state. Sort of like, we got a lot done, still got a long way to go and things like that, but there's a lot to be proud of. But the community is hard to mobilize. I think we've all, mobilized the trans community, and a lot of trans people, as we said, are dealing with their own issues and challenges. But that's where cis allies can come in too. How do we get more people involved, things like that? That's why it's a shame Love Makes a Family shut down. Not that Love Makes a Family was a good organization. It was a horrible organization, but it had a lot of power, had a lot of voice. It was able to it was messaging. They were tops of messaging. They knew how to message. They knew how to get the message out. And it's a shame there's not a trans organization that can do that in the state. And it's hard to organize in the state. We're a small state. You would think it'd be an easy state to organize in. But everything we do in the state is really localized. A lot of organizations are very localized. And I know I tried to sort of organize, state into more of a, cohesive entity. And we accomplished in getting trans visibility. No doubt about that. I remember I couldn't get one person in front of a trans pride way back in the 90s. And then all of a sudden, you go to any event and you see trans folks all over the place, which is wonderful. They're out, they're visible. There's still a lot of problems. We have barely scratched the issues of that. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, not a whole lot to add besides what people said, but I think something that I would note, right, questions about the next 6 months. Next 6 months, we're still going to be in the middle of a pandemic. And I think that's going to be something that shapes and colors everything that we do. But I think something that we have seen with this pandemic is people recognizing that there are more accessible ways to stay in touch with one another and to connect with one another. So like, for example, something as simple as support groups happening online that now people don't have to drive to. We can go to a support group via Zoom, which Zoom sucks and there's Zoom fatigue for everybody, but also it means that there's more accessibility for everybody. That also means that there's more accessibility for us staying in touch with one another, connecting with our community, and building remotely. So let's use this moment, let's use this momentum to actually remain connected with one another. Look at mutual aid projects that are happening right now that are popping off all over our state. A lot of them are trans-led. Look at different ways that you can get involved in trans organizing remotely. Look at different ways that you can remotely support trans people who are currently stuck in unsafe living situations. I think we need to be thinking about this from a pandemic lens and use the tools that this pandemic has given us, or has, I guess, forced people to acknowledge that we already have, in order to support one another, in order to stay connected with one another. And definitely remember that we should be gentle with ourselves and gentle with each other while still making sure that we're staying disciplined and building a strong movement.
All right. Thank you, everybody. That just about brings us to our time. So I'm going to thank our panelists, Raven Mathern, Jeremy Leisgang, and Ivy Staklow for their time and thoughts. And I hope to see you all in the struggle. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great afternoon.